Hello everybody, this is Fax 5. I'm just giving you a bit of an unusual introduction to this audio. So, I'm not gonna lie, this one was very difficult for me to make. Not necessarily because of the subject matter, although, for reasons you will find out soon, the subject matter was very difficult, if only because Gary Allan is very, very dense. More on him soon. Mostly just because, this piece of work that I read, it got me into a bit of a fugue state. Maybe not exactly fugue, but I just like the word fugue. It's one that got me into a weird state, a state of exhaustion and exasperation, one that is honestly something that I wanted to try to capture for all of you, my listeners, which is why I decided to edit it myself, very painstakingly. I'm still getting used to the whole advanced editing techniques. Hopefully I will improve in the near future. But I do hope that I captured the sheer emotional state I was in while recording this. I might give the shout out a bit later, depending on what I initially recorded, but I want to give a shout out to the guys at Knowledge Fight who introduced me to this guy, and I gotta say I've earned a much new respect for Dan, who does all this crazy effing research, and how just draining it can be. Hello, this is Fax 5, the only show on the internet that gives you 1/5 of your daily dose of facts. Today, I will be reading an interesting take, perhaps the most smooth-brained thing I have ever read on this show thus far. This article is called The Plan to Burn Los Angeles by Gary Allan. Gary Allan was an author for the John Birch Society, and his most famous book is a terrible screed known as None Dare Call It Conspiracy. If any of you have seen my older video on producerism, you might know that Gary Allan and the rather funny graphic he uses feature prominently in that video. Honestly, that graphic is still one of the laziest things I've ever seen. Now, this article, honestly, it requires a crap ton of disclaimers. Like, you're gonna hear me get really freaking annoyed and just get really exhausted and tired out by this crap. Likewise, due to the fact that this article is from, 1967 or whatever, there's a lot of old school language that would have been far more appropriate for when this was written, however, would not fly today, so if I can help it, I will probably not use that language. Likewise, the reason for this particular article is because I've actually read through a bunch of Gary Allan's older stuff online. However, I couldn't find a copy of this one online, so I actually had to buy it myself. I'm literally holding it right here. You can hear me wiggle the papers around. Nice. And, as for why Gary Allan? Well, I want to give a shout out to Dan and Jordan at Knowledge Fight for introducing me to this genius, because Gary Allan's None Dare Call It Conspiracy has been an influence on Alex Jones and other such conspiratorial mindsets and conspiracists in the USA. In fact, literally reading this, it legitimately sounds like something an Alex Jones type figure would say, down to the sarcastic language used. I want to say there's going to be a lot of donks in this one because there are 34 footnotes with numbers on them, and this does not include the handful of footnotes which do not have numbers on them but are just kind of aside notes. At some point I should probably scan this and upload it online so y'all can see what I'm reading. Likewise, some of the things he says are just so smooth-brained, I'm going to have to stop recording, make a little donk here or there, and explain why I'm getting so irked, annoyed, and at some cases downright insulted by the sheer stupidity that Gary Allan hawks. A lot of background context will be necessary to explain some of the stuff that is being described in the article, and in fact, even the LAPD themselves issued an official statement calling Gary Allan's nonsensical conspiratorial ramblings exactly for what they are, nonsensical conspiratorial ramblings. At the end, I will read the LAPD's response to the nonsensical ramblings of one Gary Allan. Now, before I actually get into the article, I want to give a little bit of background to the Watts Riots. The Watts Riots occurred from August 11th to 16th in 1965, and there was a lot of things that built up to it. So during the World Wars I and II, a lot of African Americans in the South took part in what are known as the First and Second Great Migrations. These were, as their names implied, migrations from the Jim Crow South to the industrializing North that many African Americans took with the hopes of getting some of those sweet unionized war jobs. Said migrations resulted in a lot of racial tensions between existing white ethnic communities and the newly migrating African American communities. And in fact, this did result in many such riots. In fact, there was even the Zoot riots of 1943, which were about similar such concerns. However, instead of white Americans in Los Angeles fearing African Americans taking their jobs, they feared Mexican Americans taking their jobs. Despite these differences, I picked the Zoot riots because they, like the Watts riots, took place in Los Angeles, and much like the Watts riots, lasted over the course of many days, in the case of the Zoot riots, lasting from June 3rd to June 8th, 1943. This will become relevant very soon. Back to the Watts riots. At this point in time, Watts was basically a red-lined area that African Americans were, for all intents and purposes, forced to move into. They were generally unable to purchase homes elsewhere in the city, and they were often denied economic opportunities, generally in the form of subsidized housing loans and other forms of state, local, and federal investments that were more readily available to white families at the time. This resulted in a lot of poverty concentrating within African American communities, as the African Americans who lived there were often denied the same economic opportunities in the private sector that their white working class counterparts would have had an easier time accessing. The straw that broke the camel's back was an arrest gone wrong in the neighborhood of Watts. While I don't feel like going into all the details right now, I'm just going to say that an arrest within the neighborhood of Watts went wrong, and a rumor eventually circulated that a white cop kicked a pregnant black woman in the stomach. From what I could figure out, these rumors were completely false. However, you had an environment that was decades in the making, lots of abuse of both private and public sector authority thrust disproportionately on African Americans, which helped create an environment of distrust towards any reasonable sort of authority. And these rumors of a white cop abusing his power by kicking a pregnant black woman in the stomach was just the straw that broke the camel's back and resulted in probably one of the most infamous and deadly riots of the time. And let me say, there were a lot of riots back then. Oh boy. Honestly, you can tell I'm already exasperated because I've actually read and discussed this article with some friends before, and it was just very, very draining at times because, like, words cannot describe just how smooth-brained Gary Allen is. And I realize this is the first time that I'm going to be reading this for an online audience, and that I'm going to have to explain a lot of the just BS that Gary Allen tries to pass off as facts. But hey, this is Facts 5'em. We're all about the facts, baby. Now, let's get into this pile of dung. Introduction. Gary Allen is a Los Angeles journalist who has covered for American Opinion such affairs as the Watts insurrection, the pro-Viet Cong protests at Berkeley, and the Delano grape strike. He is now employed in the preparation of film strips on current affairs, the latest being Showbiz in the Streets. Mr. Allen has just finished his first book, Communist Revolution in the Streets, which will be released by Western Islands on July 4th. A graduate of Stanford University, Gary Allen is married and the proud father of 3 young children. While the Watts Rebellion and its aftermath have been covered extensively by weepy sentimentalists, emotional sociologists, and even a few misanthropic militants from the constitutional underground, its meaning as a rehearsal for a nationwide revolution has never been recorded. Perhaps we shouldn't try to record it now. Perhaps we too should back away from this incredible story and pretend it isn't true. We cannot. We cannot, because to do so with knowledge of what is happening would make a mockery of everything in which we believe. Section 1. Any professionally trained police officer will tell you that riots, those which last for more than a few hours anyway, are about as spontaneous as the New Year's Day Rose Parade. Hey, remember a few minutes ago when I described the Zoot riots, a riot that happened in Los Angeles in 1943 that lasted 5 or so days, as being important very soon? Yeah, this is freaking why. I am literally in... This is literally the second paragraph. I should say, rather, the Section 1, Sentence 1, I guess if you just exclude the intro, and Gary Allen is literally giving one of the most smooth-brained openings you can possibly give. Gary Allen, if your ghost is listening to this, good. Maybe you'll learn something for once in your life. What occurred in Watts was no exception. The Board of Revolutionary Strategy, which planned, engineered, and instigated the Watts Rebellion, was composed of some 40 to 50 African Americans sent by the communists into the Los Angeles area from all over the United States. Included in the group were black Muslims, black nationalists, representatives from the paramilitary Deacons for Defense, the Communist Revolutionary Action Movement, or RAM for short, and professionals from other such militant and Marxist groups. In that list, there were 2 footnotes, one footnote for the black Muslims and one for the RAM. Truth be told, I'm not going to read every single word of all the footnotes because if I did, we'd be here even longer than we need to be, and I want to spend as little time on this as possible so that way I can eventually move on to the next Gary Allen piece and just continue to demonstrate how his type of conspiratorial rhetoric, which was once considered fringe and inappropriate for modern society, is now effectively the norm I frickin' say. So anyway, footnote 1 involves someone named Miss Lola Bell Holmes, who worked for the FBI, working undercover inside the Communist Party of Illinois. And Gary Allen says that he spoke with Miss Holmes and that Miss Holmes remembered a director of the Communist Party, or rather it says the assistant director of the Negro Commission of the Communist Party, saying effectively that he wants to try to work with and influence the paramilitary group of the Nation of Islam known as the Fruit of Islam. I should say that it doesn't actually say whether or not said assistant director actually succeeded, just that he wanted to do it. However, Gary Allen takes this as enough evidence that it happened and succeeded. Footnote 2 references a statement made by J. Edgar Hoover, which says that Stokely Carmichael has made several appearances in Watts and has been in frequent contact with the RAM leaders. Now, similar to the first footnote, this doesn't actually demonstrate that the RAM had anything to do with planning a riot. It just says that Stokely Carmichael has been seen in the Watts area and has also been seen with RAM leadership. This is the level of smooth brain we are dealing with, people. And this guy was an inspiration for Alex frickin' Jones. Like seriously, I believe that, I think Alex Jones actually references None Dare Call It Conspiracy by name a few times. Good God, this author's an idiot. These men are not hoodlums or criminals in the ordinary sense, but are drawn from among the intellectual elite of the black community. Included are physicians, attorneys, businessmen, professors, writers, and scholars. Footnote number 3 references Life magazine's edition from June 10th, 1966, specifically their article called Plotting a War on Whitey. Now, the quote he references is, "What sort of men lead the extremists? A large percentage have attended college. Some are still students, and many have advanced degrees. Among them are writers, actors, lawyers, engineers, teachers, ministers, musicians, architects, athletes, and poets. Some have been Marxists or members of the Mao-admiring progressive labor movement." Now, through the power of the internet, I was actually able to find this article online. I want to point to a quote that Gary Allen did not use, specifically this one. "In secret recesses of any ghetto in the U.S., there are dozens and hundreds of black men working resolutely toward an Armageddon in which Whitey is to be either destroyed or forced to his knees. Their avowed aim is a summer of chaos. Quote, Wattses, lots of them, only worse, much worse," end quote. Now what does this say? This says that they were freaking inspired by Watts. It doesn't say that they helped cause it, that they were inspired by it. Gary Allen clearly has no sense of time. Yet, They represent the sort of racist and twisted intellects which stimulated the Nazi takeover of Germany. This small revolutionary group, which is referred to in Watts and by law enforcement personnel simply as the organization, has 3 common denominators among its members: high intelligence, hatred of the man or Caucasians, and a disciplined commitment to the interests of the international communist conspiracy. It was this team of highly trained communists, the organization, which planned and directed what happened in Watts. Footnote number 4 is probably the first really rambly footnote because it actually consists of rather a bunch of little citations all kind of combined together for Gary Allen to try to prove the point that the titular organization planned and directed what happened in Watts. Now, such citations include Los Angeles City Councilman Gilbert Lindsay, a black man, was quoted in the LA Times and later in Human Events on August 6, 1966, in a reply to a query about Watts and other riots. Quote, "I would say, without fear of challenge, that the tense situation in America is masterminded by foreign agents. I'm talking about communists." Now, for all intents and purposes, the way this is presented in this article, it is Councilman Gilbert's opinion. Perhaps in the full article, he goes into a bit more detail, but none of this actual evidence is actually supplied within the footnote. It's just quoting a person in authority just to say, hey, this person in authority agrees with me. And I mean, it's not even like a doctor talking about medical stuff. It's just a city council member trying to say that domestic insurrection and tensions are someone else's fault. I would have to say, though, that perhaps my favorite one in footnote 4 is, let's see. The Santa Ana Register of October 4th, 1966 reports that, quote, "communist agitators and other extremists are working in LA to spark more violence like last year's Watts riots," said Los Angeles Mayor Sam Yorty. So, in this case, what he's saying is that the communists want to spark more riots and more violence similar to that of Watts. You might notice that this is not evidence that the communists or even that the titular organization planned and orchestrated Watts. And, well, I'm going to say spoiler alert, later on in the article, Gary Allen makes it very clear that they didn't just start Watts, but they basically masterminded the entire riot down to its ending somehow. Now, even adding on to this, Mayor Sam Yorty also said that while communists and other agitators were not in Watts on the first day of the riots, he said they quickly arrived on the scene. So quite literally, in the footnote that Gary Allen is trying to use as evidence that the organization, which is a bunch of communists and communist sympathizers and agitators, that this organization masterminded the entire riot, his actual footnote explicitly says they were not there on the first day. So they were able to somehow mastermind a riot without actually being there? Like they were able to control it without being there? This is like before social media was a thing. So like, this is your brain on conspiracism. As a play is given a trial run in the bushlands of Boston or New Haven before being presented in New York, or as a pugilist hones his attack by heavy sparring in the weeks before a championship bout, so also was Watts a trial run, a training exercise from which the revolutionaries sought to garner encyclopedic knowledge about colored and white reaction, law enforcement, and critical media response. Los Angeles was chosen as the stage for rehearsal because the organization believed that if it could successfully trigger a full-scale rebellion in Watts, the communists could achieve the same results among African Americans in any major metro area in the United States. Now, footnote 5 is another strange and rambling one, with many different little citations within it. Like, the first part involves a headline from Chicago's American, and which is "Reveal Pro-Castro Ring Behind West Side Riots." Try as I might, I could not find this one online. However, considering Chicago's American is a Chicago-based newspaper, I'm going to say that it is safe to assume that they were referring to the west side of Chicago rather than Watts. Likewise, another part of the footnote references the Cleveland Riots grand jury report, which said that they were planned or at least abetted by misguided people of all ages and colors, many of whom are avowed believers in extremism, and some of whom are also members or officers of the Communist Party. So I find this kind of interesting because, as you might recall, Footnote 5 was saying specifically that the organization was planning riots in other cities across the nation. However, all that the footnotes demonstrate is that there were riots in other cities in America that may or may not have had some sort of communist influence to them. They do not tie in any way back to Watts, and likewise, even if communists did incite riots in other cities, Gary Allen has yet to provide evidence that they were explicitly linked to any such organization that is part of an international communist conspiracy. I do actually have to admire the imagination on him, and yet I'm also a bit downtrodden because, let's be real here, if you're listening to this, then you've probably run into at least one person who's completely and utterly convinced that everything all the time is absolutely related. The kind of guy who will unironically talk about, Antifa members receiving Soros bucks or something. You know what I'm talking about. The organization well knew that African Americans are better off in Los Angeles than any other large city in America. In a report released just 1 year previous to the Watts Rebellion, the Urban League ranked American cities according to African American housing, employment opportunities, education, and other criteria for measuring achievement. Los Angeles led the list in virtually every category. Footnote 6 just references the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner reporting on the study that he described. From what I could figure out, he actually seems to have gotten this one correct. Granted, considering this was 1965, I can't speak for exactly how high the standards for African Americans were back then. But despite this, based on the evidence that I can currently find, he is citing this report correctly. Finally, a decent friggin' footnote. Unemployment, perpetually pointed to by the left as responsible for the frustrations which triggered the Watts Holocaust, was, according to the McCone Commission report, surprisingly low, even among those who were actually arrested during the insurrection. 73% of those arrested were employed, including many in skilled, technical, and even government work. Much like Footnote 6, Footnote 7 also seems to be correct based on the information I can glean from it. Namely, the footnote is just him, citing a report about the rather high percentage of those who were arrested in the Watts Rebellion being employed. Personally, I think this actually betrays something else in Gary Allen's thought process. Namely, he sees that all these people are employed, and yet he is incapable of wrapping his head around the possibility that anything else could have motivated such discontent. Let's assume he's being completely honest that the quote-unquote left, and yes, he actually does say the left, with L as capitalized. But yeah, let's say he did say that the left blamed unemployment and that sort of unemployment was nearly non-existent. Well, it's clear that Gary Allen is just incapable of understanding that absolutely anything else could motivate such discontent, and just immediately assumes it's part of a communist conspiracy. And it demonstrates that even if he is factually right, and by factually right I mean he just quite literally reported on a statistic that he saw and did so correctly, which is a pretty low bar, his head is so in the gutter that he just has to find some way to shoehorn it into an international communist conspiracy, rather than accept that maybe some things are wrong in his country. In Los Angeles, African Americans have access to virtually any job for which they are qualified. Indeed, civil service positions are held disproportionately by African Americans, including many black Muslims. African Americans in Los Angeles can travel wherever they please, do whatever they have the talent and capacity to do, and take advantage of virtually unlimited free education. 90% of the rest of the world would give a left ear to live in such misery. Is it any wonder that the organization felt that if Watts could be exploded, they could do it anywhere else in America? Of course, the organization realized that before a riot of the magnitude which they planned for Watts could be unleashed, the residents of that area must be well conditioned. Now we're at footnote 8, and I want to say that he doesn't actually cite the part where he just talks about the allegedly great things that African Americans in Watts' Los Angeles experience. No, he just asserts that. Rather, his citation comes from saying that the communists, or the organization rather, had to condition the people of Watts to accept a riot. The thing is that all that footnote 8 says, and honestly this is so stupid I am actually going to read the whole thing. The communists have been working in Watts for many years. Their machinations have been reported by the government time after time. In 1963, a report of the House Committee on Un-American Activities entitled United Front Techniques of the Southern California District of the Communist Party revealed that there was extensive communist activity in the Watts area of Los Angeles led by Miranda Smith's section of the Communist Party and various other communist fronts. Now seriously, all this says is that, that there's evidence that the communists were active in that area. This, of course, does not actually prove or even give any evidence that this so-called organization exists, and that if it did, said organization was responsible for orchestrating, controlling, and ending Watts. And honestly, just the sheer patronizing attitude he has earlier, this idea that, things are great in Watts, everything going wrong must be a communist front, nothing could possibly going wrong, naturally. No, you see, it's just this very paternalistic mindset he has, and it's just very, very irksome. He just asserts that things are great, and anything that's bad cannot possibly be the fault of just the way things are set up. No, they have to be these outside agitators deliberately trying to overthrow America, to throw us into chaos and confusion. The evidence? Well, I have evidence that the communists were active in this area at some point. Ooh, that's evidence. Frickin' mere. Like, seriously. If any of you have watched, I think it was my first video ever where I read through the John Birch Society's pamphlet about, what's wrong with civil rights, and it demonstrated just this extremely, extremely patronizing, condescending attitude that would honestly probably make the most smug San Franciscan blush. This entire pamphlet feels like that. For that process alone, one police officer told us, quote, the organization allotted 5 full years. The idea was to condition the people of Watts to believe that they are exploited and the victims of quote-unquote unjust laws, which they are morally free to break, end quote. The organization began by inundating Watts with printed propaganda, disgorged by the balesful from the printing presses of revolution in basements and backrooms all over Los Angeles County. Whether the press was run by the Students for a Democratic Society, the Communist Dubois Clubs, the Muslims, or other black nationalist groups, the same theme was always the same. Quote, African Americans are so brutalized and exploited that their problems can only be solved by violent revolution, end quote. Footnotes 9, 10, and 11 are included in that little area. Footnote 9 I personally find to be interesting because it is just an example of a flyer that Gary Allen claims to have from the Communist Progressive Labor Party. I will read it aloud, and 1 second. Quote, murder by cops and death by unemployment are methods of systemic extermination. This extermination isn't going to be stopped by going to the court of the exterminator. The concentration camp must develop its own court and its own method of trial. Disarm the guards in the concentration camp. I personally think this really demonstrates the type of paternalistic attitude that Gary Allen has. Because, you know what, let's just assume he's completely right. He does have this flyer. This is an official flyer made by the Communist Progressive Labor Party. Well, does he honestly think that a single flyer from a single party is all that it'll take to turn what are normally happy and apparently well-adjusted African Americans into complete and total rioters? Does he honestly see African Americans as being that stupid? I mean, okay, you can convince some people of anything if you try hard enough, but even if you do, you're going to need more than a few flyers. Alright, let's see. Footnote number 10 says, the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner of May 16th of 1967 quotes FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover as stating that during the past year, the Students for a Democratic Society, quote, seized upon every opportunity to encourage agitation and foment discord among the youth of our nation. This is what I also find to be interesting because, so, if he says this was from 1967 and J. Edgar Hoover is referring to the previous year, that would be 1966. Now, I understand that theories of time and relativity are not really my area, but I can say with absolute certainty that 1966 is not 1965 when the Watts riots happened. Alright, number 11 says, the Dubois Clubs are described by Director Hoover as, quote, a communist-inspired, Marxist-oriented youth group. The current president of the Dubois Clubs is Franklin Alexander of Watts. The group is under order from the Justice Department to register as a communist front. Okay, so there's a communist club that exists in Watts. Alright, let's assume that the Dubois Clubs are 100% communist, they want total violent revolution, and they are active in Watts. What is the evidence that they had anything to do with the Watts riot? What is the evidence that they are part of the organization? Gary Allen does not provide any of this. These inflammatory ravings were distributed all over the Watts area on street corners, in bars, barbershops, and even from door to door. Over the scheduled 5-year period, the communists' black nationalist handbills, newspapers, and other printed propaganda had a cumulative and terrible effect. The most important part of the organization's conditioning program was the construction of the myth of police brutality. Amusingly enough, there is a footnote here that does not have a number or anything. It's more just a commentary, and a little comment says, until recent years, misconduct by officers was known as police malpractice, but you'll have to admit that phrase doesn't make much of a slogan. I got a comment on Gary Allen's sarcasm. He's actually pretty good with the sarcasm, I'll give him that. But at the same time, holy heck, is this guy a bootlicker? Like, this guy is just obsessed with the authority of local police, and, well, honestly, it's actually not unusual. One of my friends is an older gentleman from Arizona whose dad was a local police detective, and said friend said that he once saw a man's bumper sticker with "Support your local police," with local being underlined, and said friend was like, oh, hey, my dad would like that. So when he told his dad about it, his dad was like, son, that's a John Birch Society campaign. And honestly, Gary Allen wrote an essay about alleged federal police authority or something to that effect. Or rather, this attempt by the feds to create some sort of federal police force that would circumvent all forms of local police control. It's something that I find kind of interesting about the John Birch Society is that they're against what they claim is the authoritarian, oppressive government of communism, but they're perfectly okay with oppressive government and will even deny that it exists so long as it is on the local scale. Moral of the story, I guess it's okay to have a boot on your neck as long as the boot has City of X instead of federal government. 5 years ago, had you ever heard the phrase police brutality? Probably not. Unless you were a student of world revolution. For although the phrase has been used by the communists for decades, it has become a part of the general lexicon only during the past few years, and only after a publicity campaign rivaling the Advertising Council's promotion of Smokey the Bear. Footnote 12 references another quote from then LA Mayor Sam Yorty, which is, "The cry of police brutality has been shouted in cities all over the world by the communists, dupes, and demagogues irrespective of the facts. Such a campaign has been vigorously pushed here in Los Angeles." So it's kind of interesting that his source for this is just that the mayor of Los Angeles asserted that such a campaign existed. Now, someone a bit more skeptical might ask, well, where is the mayor's evidence for this? And I would say that the pamphlet does not include this. If Mayor Sam Yorty actually did have evidence that is not included within either this pamphlet or even the article itself, then I will be the first to say that I could not find it, and I offer my sincerest apologies to the ghost of Mayor Sam Yorty. It took 5 years of steady repetition before the stereotype of the policeman as a brutal sadist who derives joy from harassing the innocent came to be widely accepted in Watts, but the theme did take hold. This is footnote 13, and I just realized that footnotes 12 and 13 appear one sentence apart in this article, and yet both of them are citing Mayor Sam Yorty saying the same thing on different days. I will apologize once again to the ghost of Mayor Sam Yorty if he did happen to have evidence that I was unable to find in either the Gary Allen article or any of the articles that Gary Allen cites. As a result, many people became so sure that they were going to be brutalized by the police that when arrested, they would resist. Footnote 14 references a quote from the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee report, specifically a report entitled The Plot Against the Free World Police. Truth be told, I actually tried to find this online. I had a very tricky time navigating the government's archives, and it seems that the government does not have an online version of this subcommittee report that I can easily find. The John Birch Society themselves actually sell it for $1, but I'm not giving my money to those guys. So I'll just roll with this for now. The quote in question says, "The communist attack on the police force of the free world is dangerous for 2 reasons. The first is that the attacks are fanatical, deceptive, and skilled in underground methods. The second element of communist strategy and techniques is its centralization. A campaign against the police of one free country is not planned and directed by the Communist Party of that country. It is planned and directed by the strategists of international communism." Now, I think this is actually a better quote that Gary Allen uses. And yet, despite this being a better quote, he is unable to directly tie it back to any sort of organization, nicknamed the Organization, that is active in Watts and that is responsible for orchestrating the entire Watts rebellion. Maybe in the future I will find the entire archive of this subcommittee report, but for now I'll just roll with what he used. Such resistance often gave the police no choice but to use force, and so the myth fed upon itself. A carefully created aura of hate and fear clutched at the people of Watts. When the climate was right, when the conditioning had been completed, the organization awaited only an incident. Before I even look at footnote 15, I just have to comment that Gary Allen really is just incapable of accepting that police brutality could have even been possible. You know, I have mentioned in previous videos that the John Birch Society at its height and for a very long time was not very accepted within the modern conservative movement, and in fact William F. Buckley famously denounced the John Birch Society and wanted them to be purged from the conservative movement on the grounds that they didn't actually contribute anything worthwhile, only contributing paranoia, fear, and fantasy, or something to that effect. Footnote number 15 itself references Life magazine, June 10th, 1966, which quoted a member of the Communist RAM saying, "Once everything blows up, kids are indispensable, but not in the planning stages. They'll probably provide the incident that sets it off, and they'll sure as hell keep it going. There's never in history been an armed revolution without a lot of hot kids." Okay, first, hot. Okay, that is definitely a choice of words that did not age well. I mean, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say I'm pretty sure by hot he means like hot-headed or ready for action. Thanks to the power of the internet, I was able to actually find the entire article that Gary Allen is referencing. First off, I just want to say, unsurprisingly, the planning stages are referring to the planning stages of a revolution, not a riot. However, to be fair, Gary Allen did explicitly say that this is some sort of testing ground for a revolution. And yet, I want to give you, the audience, the entire context of this quote. Now, for reference, this is a transcript of an interview that is told in a question and answer format. Okay. So, question, why don't the revolutionaries pay more attention to kids? Answer, because they're kids. They aren't ready to be revolutionaries. Question, are you saying there is no place for kids in a revolution? Answer, man, be serious. Once everything blows up, kids are indispensable, but not in the planning stages. they'll probably be the ones who provide the incident that sets it off, and they'll sure as hell keep it going. There's never in history been an armed revolution without a lot of hot kids. But oh, those baby brothers are bad news when it comes to keeping secrets. Let 'em into the movement, and we, the revolutionary brothers, would all be locked up before it started. Question: does that mean the brothers do the planning and the kids are cannon fodder? Answer: oh, come on, not cannon fodder, reserves. They do it all themselves, but then it would be a riot. RAM can handle the planning, preparation, transportation, and supplies. Things like that are the difference between a riot and a revolt. But just don't get the idea that the brothers are afraid of getting themselves killed. I swear, a lot of them will feel cheated if they don't. So, not only does the RAM leader talk specifically about how he doesn't want to plan a riot, he wants to plan a full-on revolt and eventually a revolution, but much like literally everything else so far, this fails to actually demonstrate that any such organization exists, and that such organization was responsible for orchestrating the entirety of the Watts Rebellion. In South Los Angeles, you can take your choice of dozens each day. Virtually everyone is now familiar with how the organization finally used a simple arrest for drunkenness as a rationale for igniting in Watts the most disastrous civil insurrection to occur in America in the last 100 years. The police consider it significant that the riot did not start at the time or on the spot of the arrest, which is claimed to have provided the spark. In fact, they note that all was quiet for a full 3 hours after that arrest while the organization's agitators did their job of priming teenagers for the orgy of bottle throwing, vandalism, and automobile burning that was to torch the city. Footnote 16 cites the same thing that Footnote 15 did, except Footnote 16 is focused a bit more on the weapons that are described within the article that Gary Allen is citing. The police have now learned that the organization circulated outrageous rumors about the earlier arrest, charging police brutality. Of course, he is contradicting his source, because his RAM source in that article explicitly said that kids will act as the reserves in a hypothetical revolution, not the cannon fodder or even the frontline soldiers. And yet Gary Allen is talking about how the organization, which it just doesn't freaking exist, man, but how that organization is anyway priming the children to effectively just cause destruction and, for all intents and purposes, use them as frontline cannon fodder. The police have now learned that the organization circulated outrageous rumors about the earlier arrest, charging police brutality and describing how a white cop kicked a pregnant black woman. It was the rumors which were most successful. The denizens of the area had been conditioned by the years of prior propaganda to accept such fairy tales without question. The riot could not have been touched off in front of those who actually witnessed the incident. They knew the rumors were not true. Now came the test of a 5-year investment in systematic conditioning. Would the people of South Los Angeles respond? Would they follow the organization's leadership? Could agitators trigger a riot in Watts, the city the Urban League's studies revealed to have provided the greatest opportunity for African Americans? Of course, we all know the answer. A rebellion which the first night was confined to 12 square blocks mushroomed within 3 days to cover 60 square miles. So, Footnote 17 just quotes that same Life article, quoting a revolutionary leader stating, quote, "Watts was a clear demonstration of how much hell a little organizing can raise. Thanks to the power of the internet, I actually have access to this entire article because, well, it's literally the same article each time. Or I guess I should say rather 2 separate articles within the same copy of Life. And, well, honestly, I am just going to read the entire quote in context, and oh boy, you're going to love this, alright? No extremist today claims credit for such scattered masterminding as evolved during the course of the Los Angeles Watts riots of '65. Yes, it literally opens with that. Gary Allen just completely ignores the part of the article which says, no extremist today claims credit for such scattered masterminding as evolved during the 1965 Watts riot. I freaking say. But significantly, the claim is that plans are already well in hand for quote-unquote the next one, whenever and wherever it begins. The hottest prospects of the moment, in addition to Los Angeles, seem to be Oakland, Washington, D.C., New York City, and St. Louis. Quote, Watts was a clear demonstration of how much hell a little organization can raise, says a highly involved observer. It gave these people a chance to see white cops really scared, actually on the run, from them. Just think what could happen if a highly organized ghetto like Harlem or Philadelphia, where streets are narrow and buildings are higher and snipers can control the rooftops. But it could happen anywhere, everywhere at once. Just watch. And honestly, the entirety of the malicious versus stupid argument, I'm really stuck at a standstill here. Because normally I would call it malicious to just cut out the part of the article which explicitly states that no extremist takes credit for what happened in Watts, but at the same time, he's also willing to literally include footnotes that have information within those footnotes themselves that contradict what he is saying. I must say, Gary Allen really is a man of mystery. The organization considered it vital to keep from the police and the inhabitants of the area the fact that the riots had been planned by an expert leadership. During the second day, there were numerous reports of revolutionaries directing the chaos who were wearing red armbands, using electric megaphones, also known as bullhorns. Footnote 18 references Long Beach Independent from September 13th, 1965, quote, Parker also cited instances where rioters used bullhorn to direct the mob, particularly in the destruction along 103rd Street. I was unable to find the actual full article of this. I was able to find some archives that had it, but they were either behind annoying paywalls or I had to physically go to a library somewhere in California to find it, and I'm a bit a ways from Cali. Truth be told, however, all this says is that it references rioters using bullhorns to direct a mob. I mean, okay, I'll take its word for it. That happened. I'll have to see if it mixes with any of the other quote-unquote evidence. Or maybe it was just, rioters demanding that folks get away from a certain area, like, hey, get the heck away from my shop or something like that. I mean, it's a riot. Their orders were obeyed, even though the rioters did not know their instructors. Most undoubtedly assumed they were being gifted by quote-unquote spontaneous grassroots leadership. But when the armbands and bullhorns attracted comments in the press, they disappeared. That the firebombing campaign was, quote, ordered by the leaders, end quote, has now been confirmed by the police. There is no footnote here. I just had to stop it to say, this is almost literally Alex Jones crap. Like, if you ever listen to Alex Jones, he'll almost always just make these broad remarks, or these remarks that would be damning if there was any evidence to them. Like, for example, in this case, you had the remark that when the armbands and bullhorns attracted comments in the press, they disappeared. However, the footnote earlier only referenced bullhorns, not armbands. Well, where did the armbands go? Oh, they disappeared when the press noticed them. Well, can he show me where the press noticed the armbands? But the best part is when he literally just says that it was confirmed by police, or confirmed by the police. Like, that is literally what Alex Jones says. He'll be like, it was confirmed through the white papers. And he'll just assert that something is confirmed, and then either give you nothing or give you something that is barely related, or in some cases completely contradicts the point. Honestly, I'm going to say that I can really see the influence that this man had on Alex Everett Jones and similar such individuals. Certainly, it was not a haphazard, disorganized affair, as would have been natural if the Holocaust were the work of a roaming, unled mob. Law enforcement officers have learned that certain types of businesses were marked in advance for this special attention. The police believe this accounts for the burning of nearly every building in some areas such as Central Avenue and 103rd Street, while in other areas only 1 or 2 stores per block were fired. Primarily, 4 types of structures were put to the torch: liquor stores, supermarkets, pawn shops, and department stores. My sources inside the far left explain, quote, liquor stores were looted and burned for the obvious purpose of keeping the mob intoxicated, so it could be more easily led. Supermarkets were a target because the leadership wanted the residents of the area to suffer from lack of food, knowing that their wrath and anguish would not be vented on the rioters but on the police and quote-unquote vested interests and the quote-unquote power structure. The third primary target was pawn shops in order to acquire large supplies of firearms, one of the principal reasons for the riot. The last largest was the area's department stores where the organization could acquire guns, ammunition, merchandise, and money. No footnote here, but I do have to comment. It's easier to lead a mob of drunken people? Like, seriously? Breaking into robbing a liquor store specifically so you could hand out the goods to a mob to keep them intoxicated and thus easier to lead? Oh God. I can't even bring myself to comment on the other ones. I'm literally just so caught up in the first part. I'm legitimately trying to understand the logistics of it. And like, oh God. And I mean, even the part where it's like, oh, they'll turn their anger on the police and the vested interests, but like, well, okay, yeah, this is the 1960s. Everybody nowadays can accept that in the 1960s the police were pretty awful, and it just impresses me the sheer mental gymnastics that he goes to justify the police of the 1960s. Like this idea that there's no possible reason anyone could naturally hate them or that anyone could be upset with their performance in law enforcement or lack thereof in other cases. No, everything's got to be part of a grander conspiracy to make them look bad. The local police, they are my baby. I love them. They can never do anything wrong. Just pretend I had some deep, profound comment on the other three parts of that plan. I'm really just so caught up on the idea of trying to intoxicate people to make them easier to lead in a mob. It is indicative of the careful planning that one of the first things the mob leaders went for upon entering a store was the files of accounts receivable. Police officers have confirmed that this was on direction from the organization. The looters even got into a savings and loan association where they methodically set about burning loan records. Footnote number 19 just is a reference to a security officer conference that says that, banks and savings and loans associations should keep their loan records in locations outside the main building to avoid those records being destroyed. Now, interestingly, it seems that Gary Allen has never heard of Pretty Boy Floyd, the Depression-era bank robber who, among other things, was famous for deliberately destroying loan records during the Great Depression so that way banks could not foreclose on people's houses. Interestingly, Gary Allen is just incapable of accepting that maybe people were angry at financial institutions for hawking predatory loans on African American communities. The organization structured its revolt to keep the fire department away from burning businesses with sniper fire so that any potential police evidence would be consumed in the flames, and as a result the fire department finally refused to answer calls without a National Guard protection. Yet despite the thousands of rounds expended by snipers during the 4-day mutiny, not one fireman or policeman was hit. Bad shooting? A black policeman assigned to Watts explained that the snipers, quote, were under orders to shoot to miss. While the snipers served to keep police and firemen from the area during the looting, the organization knew that the killing of police officers would have led to complete martial law and also to house-to-house search, which would have cost the revolutionaries their guns and loot. One of the primary objectives of the riot, he told me, was loot. The leaders knew that a mob will loot during a disaster, and they wanted law enforcement officials to assume the days of goods stealing in Watts were a natural reaction to the events taking place, and that it was random looters who got the merchandise. The snipers were covering the looters. End quote. Footnote 20 references two publications. The first is the 1965 November issue of a Berkeley publication known as Spider, which has black nationalists claiming that since some African Americans have been in the army, they know how to shoot when they want to hit something. The next one is a reference to, quote, page 4 of the Progressive Labor Party's The Revolt in Watts and the Coming Battle, which says, instead of aiming to miss, those who defend our black men, women, and children against racist extermination campaigns would aim to hit. So, this is something that I find kind of interesting because, well, the 1965 Spider thing, I haven't been able to find it myself. However, Gary Allen does not specify if they were specifically referring to snipers at the Watts riot, while, of course, the next one deliberately contradicts what Gary Allen is saying, because the Progressive Labor Party thing effectively says that if these snipers were part of the Progressive Labor Party's organization, then they would not have shot to miss. Considering the Progressive Labor Party is a member of this nebulous organization, you'd assume that their members would have really wanted to shoot to hit, and that they would have not lightly taken orders to shoot to miss after apparently being conditioned for such a bloody revolution for at least 5-ish years, probably longer if you're an actual member. Yet it's just very difficult for me to believe that after having just such a bloodthirst for a revolution, that their members would have the opportunity right there and then just gladly accept orders to not kill anybody with their sniper rifles. Los Angeles law enforcement officers believe that as much as 90% of the firearms and money stolen during the riot went to the organization, as did the bulk of the merchandise. It is true that ordinary looters took goods, but the great bulk of the pillaged furniture and appliances were simply stacked on sidewalks until a panel or pickup truck arrived to load the spoils. Nobody touched that merchandise while it sat there. It belonged to the organization, and the riot leaders made that very clear. While Watts burned, other riots flared very briefly in other cities around the country. Americans generally assumed that they were sympathy demonstrations for the quote-unquote brothers in South Los Angeles. Police now know that they were more than that. The organization was testing to see if it was possible to start a chain reaction of riots, and as soon as they were satisfied that they could, the infant rebellions in other cities were halted. There's no footnote here, but I really need to take the time to just emphasize the sheer skill that Gary Allen gives to the organization. So, first off, the titular organization is able to unite a bunch of radical groups, most of them being radical leftist, except for the black Muslims. I don't know what they count as. I guess they are their own weird thing. They're able to get them to get along under one umbrella and just respect the leadership of the organization, even if the organization gives these groups orders that would fundamentally contradict what these groups want. Likewise, everybody in Los Angeles is just kind of aware of the organization, aware of the power that they have, and is too afraid to challenge them. Yet despite this, the organization is still able to mentally condition the African American communities of Watts and I guess South Los Angeles in general to just accept certain things as some sort of visceral reaction, despite these people being well aware of the group and presumably being well aware that they are being conditioned and played for fools, and yet they still fall for it anyway. The organization then is able to use this to cause a riot that destroys a lot of Los Angeles. They maintain this riot by robbing liquor stores to specifically get a lot of people in a mob drunk, so that way the angry mob would be easier to control. Then, when their looters put all of the cool stuff on the curb for later, these same drunken rioters don't actually take any of the cool stuff for themselves. They don't even just fall asleep on the couch or piss on it or anything, because everybody just kind of knows about it. And to top it off, this organization has chapters in cities all over the USA, and they are capable of simply starting and stopping uprisings just like that. I'll be honest, if there was any organization this powerful, I'd be terrified too. The Watts insurrection, police informants say, was designed to 1. Test the ability of the revolutionaries to start and maintain a large-scale riot, and 2. To acquire guns, merchandise, and money for next time. These aims were achieved, and when the National Guard arrived on the scene, the sniping, burning, and looting were turned off like a water faucet lest martial law and a house-to-house search be effectively instituted. Los Angeles police officers have determined that during the months succeeding the riot, the organization moved to sell its stolen merchandise from 10 to 15% of its market value throughout the western United States and even in Canada. Would you like a color TV for $75 or a $200 suit for $30? See your local black Muslim fence. Out of storage areas all over South Los Angeles poured washing machines, toasters, sewing machines, and literally a complete merchandise mart. Police are convinced that the cash from this bargain basement distress sale, along with the money confiscated from supermarket and department store safes, was poured into the purchase of more weapons. Although authorities estimate the revolutionaries acquired more than 20,000 guns from the riot, one gun dealer alone lost 2,500 firearms. These consisted mostly of handguns or small-bore rifles and shotguns. Police investigators in the Watts area believe that the organization invested its stolen cash and the proceeds from its fenced loot in semi-automatic rifles, full automatic rifles, 30 caliber machine guns, 50 caliber machine guns, hand grenades, 3.5-inch rocket launchers, and mortars. Footnote 21 references 2 things. The first is that edition of Life magazine that has been referenced many times already. The quote in particular is just referencing how there are extremist groups with a lot of weapons. It does not say that these weapons were purchased by using funds from the proceeds of looted goods during the Watts Rebellion, nor does it even say where they got these weapons in general, just that they have them. The second thing is referencing a communist who fled from America to Cuba, saying that certain big weapons can be bought clandestinely from servicemen anxious to make a fast dollar. Much like the other source, it does not say if any of these weapons were purchased with proceeds that were raised from the illicit sale of looted goods, just that it is hypothetically possible to illegally purchase large guns if you know where to look. These weapons are available from government surplus stores in a condition of quote-unquote deactivation, which means that only an easily replaced firing pin has been removed. In fact, one policeman told me, "You can buy a tank if you know how to buy it. Certainly we can go to a surplus store over on Lancashire Boulevard and I can show you where you can buy mortars and anti-tank guns." The obvious question is, why didn't the story of the organization come out in the McCone investigation? We have been unable to determine whether the late Chief William Parker gave information about the organization to the committee. We have determined that not all testimony given was released. Whatever the answer, it is doubtful that Parker would have dared tell the commission all he knew, because of the probability that his substantiating sources would have thereby been compromised to the revolutionaries. A potential leak, for example, could have been the quote-unquote Reverend James Jones, a member of the McCone Commission, who had previously been elected to the Los Angeles School Board with the full backing of the Communist Party. Not a footnote here, but I did just have to say that he literally just confirmed what I said earlier. It's just some cop saying, "Oh, you can buy really big guns if you know where to look." Also, when I saw Reverend James Jones, I actually had to check to make sure that it wasn't the Jim Jones who we're all a bit more familiar with. It likely isn't, as I found the LA Times obituary of a man named Reverend James Jones, who, according to his obituary, was a Presbyterian minister, a civil rights activist, and the first black president of the LA Board of Education. He died at age 82 in 1998. But what now? What is the organization planning for the future? That is the story about which law enforcement personnel in Los Angeles are worried. That the organization is preparing for next time is no secret. Spark, a widely circulated newspaper in Watts, has even gone so far as to publish a map marking industrial plants to be special objects of attack. The map is highly significant as Spark is a publication of the Communist Progressive Labor Party. Here we have footnotes 22 and 23. Footnote 22 references Police Chief Thomas Reddin's statements in the LA Times of February 21st, 1967, which referenced various threats that Reddin received about how next time there would be more damage and you'd better be ready. Predictably, Gary Allen fails to actually tie this back into in any way proving that any such organization exists. Taking the footnote at its word, the sources of these threats are not listed. However, I would not be surprised if the police chief did not reveal where these threats came from. Footnote 23 is about a pamphlet which, according to the author, is available for 5 cents from the Communist Progressive Labor Party, and that has been reprinted in various conservative magazines, most notably Human Events. I will give the author the benefit of the doubt and assume that this flyer does exist. I can't actually check and try to buy it for myself for 5 cents anymore. However, even if it does, it rather demonstrates the fact that, these rioters did not get what they wanted and are trying to incite people to do something dangerous next time. It does not demonstrate that this specific riot was in any way led by this group or any organization that might be affiliated or leading them. Likewise, I'm honestly still just trying to imagine this apparently very bloodthirsty group just kind of obeying the leadership of someone who's telling them to, not go all out and destroy things. I can only imagine what that's like. Of course, let's be honest, we all know it didn't actually happen, but I'm just trying to hypothetically imagine what that would be like. So concerned about the matter was Los Angeles Mayor Sam Yorty that he took the communists' map to the California legislature, asking for special legislation to help protect Los Angeles when the organization decides to move. That it plans to move is beyond doubt. Witness the words of Communist Progressive Labor propagandist Bill McAdoo in Spark of May, 1966. These factories are completely vulnerable and can be shut down with a minimum of preparation, personnel, and effort. Once the weakest flank of the enemy is discovered, 1,000,000 ways will be found to focus the full strength of resistance so that every blow drives straight to his heart. The black people of South Los Angeles possess a weapon more powerful than 22,000 guns, and black people can choose their own time and places of battle. End quote. No footnote here, but I do want to say that on the page there is currently a map. I will just put this map right up on screen, so that way, for the duration of this, you will know exactly what it is I am talking about. The above appeared directly to the left of the communists' target-marked map. There is no question about what it means, nor is there any question about the fact that the Communist Progressive Labor Party is already organizing for next time. The following is a letter from a PLP appeal of December 1966. War is being waged against Afro-Americans, a war that is unprecedented in its systemic viciousness. Black ghettos across the nation must be brought into a position of wartime readiness and vigilance. Criminal invaders who are sent to murder and maim black Americans must be repelled and annihilated. We must annihilate the enemy who invades our homes, and we must punish the imperialists who sent them. In short, we must be prepared to defend ourselves in the most systematic and organized fashion possible. We must organize door by door, house by house, block by block, ghetto by ghetto. End quote. Again, the revolutionary aim of the above is more than clear. As Communist Progressive Labor leader John Harris... A footnote without a number appears here to say, Harris is now under indictment for criminal syndicalism. Declared late last year, quote, "It is necessary to build a mass movement of the black people who are willing to fight for the revolution at home," end quote. Spark underlined the same theme in its issue for September. This year for a black revolution. We want the world to know. We want to set a fire right here on Broadway rather than go to Vietnam and fight. We would rather fight for the African American here. What does all this really mean? Is it merely the brittle rant of impotent frustration? If more proof of its seriousness is needed, Perhaps the following from one of the communist pamphlets being widely circulated on Watts street corners and even door to door will help explain. Quote, "The Communist Party of the United States of America, Marxist-Leninist, urges the formation of people's defense groups and points out that the only way to oppose reactionary violence is with reactionary violence." There's no footnote here, but I want to say I just realized this is a typo because earlier in this pamphlet, even though you can't see it, in fact I will just put it on screen right now, there is a copy of a flyer from this group which says, "Oppose reactionary violence with revolutionary violence." However, after reading this so many times, I haven't even noticed that this literally says, "Oppose reactionary violence with reactionary violence." As was stated by M.I. Lasky, spokesman for the Communist Party USA, Marxist-Leninist, "Our aim is to lead the working class in revolution. We will develop and encourage people's defense groups for the defense of the working class against the terror of the ruling class. The party will assist all groups and individuals in the formation of people's defense groups." End quote. You see, the Revolutionary Army for next time is already being organized and recruited, openly, blatantly. So much so that the communists have even announced in advance that their preparations are designed to meet the U.S. Army in open warfare. Witness the following, for example, from another communist newspaper circulated in Watts. Quote, "When people have the will to resist, they can keep the entire army at bay. Since the government will use every weapon of terror to crush resistance, the people must build and train their own self-defense organization." End quote. Or note this from a typical recruiting broadside for the Black Guerrilla Army of next time. Quote, "We, the United Black Youth, will not be sold and join this white beast's army who will turn you into Uncle Toms, that will, by his control, will kill and kill his black brothers here at home and abroad. If you must join an army, join your own Black Guerrilla Army and fight these warmongers and oppressors who rape, kill, and plunder all black people all over the world. If we shall spill blood, then let us do it killing this white beast." End quote. There is no footnote here, and I do want to say that I'm going to assume that, footnote accepted, these are accurate depictions of the various flyers. I find it interesting that he spent a while talking specifically about the Progressive Labor Party. However, then he moves to the Communist Party of the USA, Marxist-Leninist. Then he moves to just another unnamed group, and then eventually the Black Guerrilla Army. And the implication is that they are all working together under the organization. However, he has not in any way demonstrated that they are working together or that they even get along with one another. However, the way you can tell by the way that he's basically primed his audience to accept this, that they will just presumably, or at least ideally, just accept the idea, oh, they must be working together under this organization. Which, there is no such thing. No wonder Los Angeles law enforcement officers are concerned. The organization is already armed to the teeth. Guerrilla recruitment is already underway. And organization on a block-by-block basis has been openly proposed and is being activated. Police informants are even now detailing the communists' preparations for the guerrilla warfare being planned. Yes, there is certainly considerable room for concern. The organization's specific plans are already known to government agencies, yet because the identities of the key members of the organization and the location of its armories are not yet known, there is very little police and other law enforcement organizations can do until the communists actually move. Footnote 24 doesn't even cite anything. It just says, I'm just going to read the whole thing. One known leader is Max Stanford of the Communist Revolutionary Action Movement. That's literally all it says. They are thus awaiting the riot, the revolution. The exact date, if it has not been set, is known only to the communists and is a most highly guarded secret. Law officers have been well advised that, when it happens, the revolutionaries intend to begin by placing from Watts 100 to 150 calls to the Los Angeles Police Department within a short period of time. This is not an exceptional number of calls for this 60 square mile area on a weekend night. The callers will report burglaries, family disputes, every sort of complaint imaginable, but nothing to put the police on alert so they could send in all the units at once. Police informants say that this time when law enforcement officers arrive, the organization's revolutionaries plan to be waiting for them. Somewhere in Watts, an officer will walk into a house and a shotgun will be emptied into his head, just that quick. The police have learned that, unlike the strategy of the previous insurrection, this time the organization has made plans to kill as many police officers as it can in the shortest possible time. The communists realize that this first phase can last only 5 or 10 minutes before one of the officers enticed into the area is able to escape his assassins and radio for help. The result will be that units from all over Los Angeles will be dispatched into Watts, whereupon the revolutionaries intend to seal off the troubled section, trapping as many policemen as they can. The officers, with 2 policemen to a patrol car, are armed with 1 shotgun with 4 rounds of ammunition and 2 pistols with 18 bullets apiece. They will be facing high-powered automatic weapons. The revolutionaries hope to kill the encircled policemen to the man. A grim fairy tale? Los Angeles police officers says it is not. They say it is already planned. They say it may as well happen. The organization's plans thus far known to the police require that simultaneously as the trapped officers are being butchered in the sealed area, other insurgent units will destroy Central Division and Valley Services Division, the 2 sources of Los Angeles's police communications. Whether the plan is to do this with an open attack using rocket launchers or by sabotage is not yet known. All that would be required would be for infiltrators at these 2 stations to bring dynamite in their lunchboxes. If they can knock out operations at these 2 key divisions, and the police officers who provided this information say there is no doubt they can, communications between police cars will be eliminated, as those are the only 2 sources of transmission, and the system is set up in such a way that one patrol car cannot directly radio another. Central Division, Hollywood Division, Wilshire, Hollenbeck, University, Newton, 77th Division, Highland Park, Rampart, and the Harbor Station all get their communication from Central Division. Van Noy, West Valley, Foothill, and North Hollywood get their radio messages from Valley Services Division. With both knocked out, all police cars in Los Angeles will be without communications of any kind. The natural reaction for a policeman when he realizes his radio equipment is inoperative is to go to the nearest police call box to telephone his headquarters to find out what has happened. The revolutionaries' plans call for booby-trapping some of these boxes and covering others with snipers. Footnote 25 is actually the first footnote he's given for any part of this, very detailed plan he is somehow able to lay out. Let's see what it says. And would you look at that? It's that same Life magazine. It says, explosive booby traps on police telephone boxes can be employed. High-power sniper rifles are readily available. So again, all he's doing is saying that some communist somewhere has said that it is hypothetically possible to do this. Now granted, this was the 1960s, a much more violent time, and a lot of left-wing violence that would honestly make Antifa look like a picket line. So I don't put it past this person to have actually planned to do this and maybe even done it. However, even if this individual is being completely honest, has plans to do it, and or has already done it, it does not in any way prove that there is an organization in the LA area that is planning to use such tactics in a nationwide communist takeover. The police have known for some time that militant black nationalist organizations in Los Angeles have a roster of all police personnel in the city of LA. They also know that the revolutionaries have discussed sending assassins to the homes of individual policemen to kill officers who are off duty along with their families. Even if the officer is not at home, they expect he will be so stunned by the slaughter of his family that he will not report for duty. With the police department decimated, the Burn LA Burn campaign will begin. Police know that the organization's plans now call for starting fires in the oil fields near the harbor and brush fires in the foothills which ring Los Angeles like a half moon. The organization realizes that a mere 50 people, each with 5-gallon cans of gasoline, could start diversionary fires which would require thousands of firefighters to extinguish. Footnote 26 follows effectively that same pattern. You cite that same June 10th Life magazine in which some revolutionary violent dude discusses how it would be a good idea to commit a certain action, to which Gary Allen then automatically assumes that the organization has that exact same plan regardless of whether or not the individual interviewed in the article has even any relation to California. Aye. Police know that the organization's plans now call for starting fires in the oil fields near the harbor and brush fires in the foothills which ring Los Angeles like a half moon. The organization realizes that a mere 50 people, each with 5-gallon cans of gasoline, could start diversionary fires which would require thousands of firefighters to extinguish. Footnote 27 references a similar plan for San Bernardino, in which the San Bernardino police officers caught a bunch of, it just says subversive activities. It does not actually say who these people are or what their motivation was. However, taking the footnote at its word, it references how, quote, "These people we were checking on had the intention of setting 15 fires in the San Gabriel and San Bernardino mountain ranges. They wanted to draw all fire equipment possible away from the valley area and tie up the sheriff's office and the CHP, or California Highway Patrol, on traffic control and evacuation of the mountain population. At sundown, they planned to physically destroy all law enforcement and fire communication systems, plus the Pacific telephone microwave system. These people had the organization and the capability to carry this out." Okay, even assuming this exists, are these people affiliated with the organization? Who are these people affiliated with? Just because one group planned to do a particularly heinous act of violence against, cops and firefighters in no way, shape, or form constitutes as any sort of evidence or proof that the organization exists or that the organization had plans to pull a similar such stunt. The strategy is to get as many firemen as possible out of downtown Los Angeles before attempting to put the Civic Center to the torch. Okay, so it's all about lighting up the Civic Center, but footnote 28 quotes the police chief saying, and I quote, "During a major disorder, the fire and police capabilities will be stretched to the complete breaking point, and private security organizations generally will be ineffective. How best to protect property and to what extent to risk," chief saying, and a lap of management. This has literally nothing to do with the Civic Center. Literally nothing. I mean, there is one more sentence where he says that this is the age of the Molotov cocktail, but literally nothing about where's the Civic Center? I was promised a Civic Center on fire. Where is my burning Civic Center? Another primary target is the fashionable Wilshire area, only a Molotov cocktail's throw away from the quote-unquote ghetto. Police informants report that the organization hopes to herd its quote ghetto mobs into Beverly Hills, whose inhabitants own many of the businesses and rental properties in the quote-unquote ghetto. While this is a notoriously quote-unquote liberal area, Jimmy Roosevelt was their congressman, it is, to the black nationalists, an object of intense hate. As mobs circulate across the city, the organization's plans call for the shooting on sight of all white men and children. Hey, would you look at that? That same Life magazine in which an anonymous revolutionary black nationalist says that all the white men are targets. And wow, would you look at what's not there? Any evidence that said anonymous black man is in any way related to this organization. Or even that said organization exists. The women and children are to be utilized as a reward for the insurrectionists. You are probably asking yourself, but what do these people think the National Guard will be doing during all of this? Remember, it took the full strength of Cali's National Guard to subdue Watts in August of 65. What will the Guard be able to do when there are concurrent revolts in San Diego, Long Beach, Compton, Pasadena, Bakersfield, Fresno, San Francisco, Oakland, Richmond, and Sacramento? There are simply not enough guardsmen to put down a great insurrection once the communists have got it going. This is what the revolutionaries plan, a revolution which will start in Watts and spread to every major urban area in the country and throughout the rural South. Footnote 30 is a bit of an odd one. I'm just going to read it all out loud. It says, information presented to the author since the first publication of this article indicates that an even more frightening situation now exists. Much of the transportation, automatic weapons, and radio equipment of the National Guard has been removed from local armories and sent to Vietnam. While it would be an exaggeration to say that in the event of another riot the National Guard would have to go to the battleground in taxis, the ability of the Guard to make a strong and flexible response has been eliminated, and our cities left largely defenseless except for our local police. During the Watts Rebellion, it took the full strength of the National Guard from all over the state to restore order. The nearest ready troops were in Salt Lake City. Since the Guard has been severely weakened, what will happen if there is a chain reaction of riots in all major cities, such as what the communists and black nationalists brag they are working to bring about? Well, I guess we'll never find out, because it hasn't happened. Why will the revolution start in Watts and not Harlem or in some other major city? Because Watts has been made into a symbol for the communists' revolutionary black nationalists. It packs the same emotional wallop for the forces of black power that Pearl Harbor did to Americans during World War II. The police officers whose investigations support this story are convinced that next time, as the rebellion grows, the communists plan to conduct a terrorist campaign within the black community itself. Just as the FLN did among the Muslims during the communist takeover of Algeria, the revolutionaries know from experience that 10% of the citizens of Watts, for one reason or another, will follow their leadership. The balance, as George Schuyler indicated in the March issue of American Opinion, are fundamentally decent and have rejected violence as any kind of answer to their problems. The revolutionaries intend to give this majority sentiment of the black community no choice but to join them. A chief weapon will be the assassination of Watts's anti-revolutionary leadership and those who are considered to be black bourgeois and Uncle Toms. The communists planning this horror have given extensive thought to the reaction of the white community to their black nationalist uprising. The organization expects the police have learned that as the Holocaust builds, it will occur to Whitey that he doesn't have much of a chance alone if a mob shows up at his door, and that therefore whites will band together with their neighbors to keep invaders out of their neighborhood, and will then invade black neighborhoods in retaliation. This is exactly the reaction the communists are hoping for. If they can infuriate and goad whites into invading black neighborhoods, then the 90% of African Americans who want no part of the revolution will have no choice but to get involved. The decent African American has to protect his home and his family just like anyone else. If the Caucasians can be driven to attack the black community, the organization reasons its revolution can be made to grow into a full-fledged race war, the very thing the communists want most. Okay, footnote 31 is actually surprisingly good, at least by the very low bar set. We can't stress too strongly that if you react to the information contained in this article with racist anger, you are falling into the communists' trap. They thrive on hate. We must face facts, but let's put the blame where it belongs, on the communists. So it's kind of interesting that, this specific footnote at the end, it demonstrates the oddly, for lack of a better word, colorblind approach that Gary Allen at least seems to want to take. But at the same time, when you take it with the rather condescending attitude he has towards a lot of African Americans earlier in the article, it for lack of a better word, betrays at least some sort of subconscious belief that Gary Allen holds. Now, some of you might recall me reading the John Birch Society's very, very condescending and anger-inducing pamphlet on the ills of the civil rights movement and how it's a secret communist front or something to that effect. And you might notice that the claims made in this article actually kind of match that pamphlet earlier. This idea that civil rights are not really a big issue, that society is by and large okay, that racial hatred is pretty much gone, and that any racial hatred that is present is either a minority of racist individuals or something deliberately stirred up by the communists to try to foment a revolution. Now, granted, the communists seem to want a popular revolution, which I personally think would be very difficult to pull off if the working class is involved in a race war. However, Gary Allen has demonstrated that wherever his head is, it's not in reality. Section 3. I grant you that the story I have just related is incredible. I grant you even that it goes so far as to border on the fantastic. Footnote 32 reads, "The tactics involved in this plan are not new. They have been used by the communists all over the world for decades. A description of just such a Holocaust as that now being planned is contained in former communist Jan Baldin's book Out of the Night, in which the author tells of his participation in a similar communist uprising in Hamburg, Germany on October 22nd and 23rd of 1923. I did check, Jan Baldin is a real person. He did write that book. I'm going to assume that Gary Allen is accurately reporting on it because I'm just not up for reading that entire book just to make a point on a single footnote. Maybe later, I guess. However, again, if none of this is secret, he should at least be able to provide some evidence that the organization, in some way, shape, or form, exists. That the communists are talking about this effort as a disruptive blow at the time of some nuclear ultimatum may be highly important. That they see it also as a means of forcing the president to bring our troops home from Europe and Vietnam to maintain civil order in the United States may also be important. But wherever and however it is planned to happen, unless action is taken to stop it before the organization can move, it is going to happen. Last footnote, baby. Footnote 34. We're finally here. It says, from that same Life magazine. The major concern of the responsible African-American elements is the speed with which the revolutionaries' message is catching fire among the young in the teeming black compounds, the Harlems, the Wattses, South Sides, and Levy districts of the land. That's it? Where's the organization? Where's any evidence of the organization? Where's any evidence that all these groups are actually working together under some shadowy umbrella? I was promised an organization. I feel so let down. It is long past the time that Americans should have demanded our police be allowed to put a stop to the paramilitary buildup in the ghettos. Federal aid won't do it. Enforcement of America's sedition laws might. And this is where it ends. Now, I did promise this because, I think it is very important. It's a little addendum to this article by Gary Allen. Specifically, it is an article from the LA Times, April 28, 1967, titled, Watts Riot as Rehearsal for Red Coup Discounted by Gene Blake, Time staff writer. Police Chief Tom Redden has disputed a John Birch Society magazine article citing unnamed police as authority that the 1965 Watts Riot was a rehearsal for a nationwide communist revolution to be touched off by total burning of LA. Quote, the facts as stated in the article are not based on information in our files, Redden said. We do not reach the same conclusions the writer does. We do not make the same reading. The article in the May issue of American Opinion is entitled, The Plan to Burn Los Angeles. It was written by Gary Allen, identified as a Los Angeles journalist and Stanford graduate. Allen writes that his information came from LA police officers, and particularly the intelligence division of the police department. Quote, we have investigated to determine whom he may have talked to, end quote, Redden said. It was nobody in a position of authority, not I, the intelligence captain, nor the former police chief, the late William H. Parker. Wouldn't have talked. Redden conceded the writer may have talked to someone at the working level, but Captain Harold E. Yarnall, Jr., head of the Intelligence Division, said an investigation failed to turn up any officer whom the writer had talked. If we had such information, we wouldn't talk to a writer, Yarnall pointed out. Yarnall said the article attempts to recite some history we believe is not based on fact, and then attempts to recite a major plot in the making. It is not our position that the August 1965 riot was communist-inspired, he said. We have never been able to isolate any group as being motivating forces or manipulators. Nevertheless, the article says it was a team of, quote, highly trained communists, end quote, known to the Intelligence Division as the organization that planned and directed what happened in Watts. The article claims that the Board of Revolutionary Strategy was composed of 40 to 50 African Americans sent by the communists into the LA area from all over the US. No organization found. It said they included black Muslims, black nationalists, representatives from the paramilitary Deacons for Defense, the Communist Revolutionary Action Party, RAM, and professionals from other such militant and Marxist groups. Said Yarnall, we haven't been able to establish that any organization had anything to do with it. 3 or 4 groups wanted to take the credit, but when someone seriously became interested in talking to them, they backed down. I'm sure the Communist Party is gleefully watching every bit of discussion, but they haven't got out in front. The article specifically mentions reports that during the rioting, men wearing red armbands and speaking through bullhorns gave directions to the mobs. Yarnall said that thorough investigation has failed to substantiate such reports. The article also claims that the rioters used stolen loot to build up an arsenal of weapons to be employed in the forthcoming major communist revolution. The only arsenals we found have been those of paramilitary right-wing groups, Yarnall said. Oh, God. Okay, that I didn't expect. Okay. Oh God. Okay. That I didn't expect that. I knew this article existed. I've never actually read it out loud before. Now that I think about it, I don't know if I've even read through the whole thing. I was normally just too tired after reading this to get into it. And then I was like, all right, I'll just read that little newspaper clipping later. And I just never got around to it. But oh my God, that was, man, some things never change, do they? Quote, Assassination of Police. The article says that when the signal for the revolution is given, hundreds of officers will be lured into the Watts area by calls for police help, but will be assassinated. Then the plan calls for destruction of the Central and Valley Services Divisions, the 2 main sources of police communications, possibly with rocket launchers or dynamite. Off-duty policemen would be assassinated in their homes. Next, the torch would be put to Los Angeles, first in the surrounding oil fields and foothills, then the Civic Center and the Wilshire area. Mobs would shoot all white men and children on sight, with the women being used as rewards for the insurrectionists. Finally, the revolution would spread to other urban areas across the country, the article claims. Yarnall said that the purported plot is reminiscent of weekly rumors, which poured in after the 1965 riot and reached a peak last July. All rumors investigated. We maintain our rumor board, he said. Everything we hear, we log and investigate. We've never been able to substantiate anything. We would certainly be foolish to say it can't happen, but we don't know of any organized plot. We've heard many rumors, and we would be interested in any information Mr. Allen has to substantiate them. Yarnall said Allen even missed one of the best rumors, that gasoline tanker trucks would be used to spray gasoline on Civic Center buildings to set them afire. I don't know why they print such stuff, Yarnall said. All it does is give some of these kooks ideas. This actually does remind me of the thing that Hofstadter pointed out in The Paranoid Style in American Politics, namely the fact that the paranoid individuals have their own lurid fantasies of sex and or violence, which they then kind of project onto their imagined enemies. And in this case, even though I'm no Freudian psychoanalyst or anything, I do wonder, does Gary Allen just have this secret, almost subconscious bloodlust, just this desire to see things burn to the ground, not even metaphorically, but literally burn to the ground? I'm aware of people who want things to metaphorically burn to the ground so they could start over or something, but does Gary Allen just have this, secret desire for destruction and bloodlust or something like that? I mean, let's just reiterate how he claimed the Watts riot went down. So first you had the organization take a 5-year-long campaign to try to condition the African-American community of Watts to be receptive to lurid tales of police brutality. This then helped them incite a riot when they deliberately spread malicious rumors that a white cop kicked a pregnant black woman. The organization then began to loot liquor stores, which they then gave to the angry mob to somehow make them easier to control. Then, amidst all the rioting and looting, the organization just had so much power that they were able to steal stuff without, any of these drunk people trying to steal it for themselves or, piss on it or just even fall asleep on the couches, because they also looted furniture. Likewise, they had such ironclad control over their snipers that the snipers shot to miss, despite the fact that some of these groups, specifically the Progressive Labor Party, clearly has such an open desire for bloodlust and a desire to shoot to kill that I would have a hard time believing that you could convince them to shoot to miss in any way, shape, or form. This organization was then able to start up miniature rebellions in cities all over the USA. And then just with perfect control, the organization was able to put a stop to the miniature rebellions without anything else going wrong, and they were able to just stop everything that happened in LA. Honestly, if anything were that well organized, we would have had a communist revolution a long time ago. That's all I'm going to say about it. I mean, seriously, this was written in the late 60s or something, and yeah, I'll put the exact date on the video. But, where is the communist revolution, Gary Allen? Where is it? I was promised a communist revolution. I was promised such a well-organized organization that would basically be unstoppable. And yet it never happened. Of course, this didn't stop Gary Allen from writing even more drivel. And of course, you can see the inspiration that this man had on Alex Jones. Specifically just his regular assertions that things are confirmed and that they are true, and that various people in certain authority know it is true, and that it is just some sort of public knowledge that anyone can look for, and the best part being that if you even look at most of the information he gives, it is tangentially related, it will completely contradict what he's saying, or is related to something completely and utterly different. Truth be told, it was insulting to my intelligence, it was extremely hollow, it was extremely paranoid, it was downright pathetic, and honestly, I can't wait to read the next one.
Hello, this is Fax5 saying thank you for listening, and I sincerely hope that you enjoyed it. If you can, please like and share it around, and if you're feeling especially generous, please subscribe. I need at least 100 subscribers to change my YouTube channel's URL, and my default is long and ugly, and I really don't like it. It would be extremely helpful for me if you subscribed. But you don't have to. I'm not your boss. I'm just Fax5, and right now, I'm signing off.